There is evidence that the Jesuits attempted to assassinate a few American presidents before the war between the states. The first president they assassinated was George Washington. He was poisoned with anthrax. One of his 3 attending physicians was behind that poisoning. Remember, from the day he took sick to the day he died was a mere 2 to 2.5 days, according to Headley's great work, The Life of Washington. So he was murdered.
Why would the Jesuits want to kill George Washington? Like Jefferson, Adams, and Monroe, Washington was first and foremost a nationalist and warned against foreign influence. He promoted a policy of neutrality and the avoidance of European alliances. Washington repeated his isolationist policy in his farewell address that was published in newspapers throughout the country. Washington wrote, "It is our policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." Besides this admonition to avoid foreign alliances, Washington loudly declared America should keep itself free from foreign influence. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake. In addition to these publicly expressed opinions, Washington had acted swiftly to put down the Jacobin-inspired Whiskey Rebellion in 1793 with 15,000 troops. Instigating the rebellion was the French ambassador Edmond Guinet and the revolutionary Democratic clubs that had sprung up in America. Guinet and the Democratic clubs were linked to the Jacobin clubs in France. In her book, World Revolution, Nesta Webster states, "These Jacobin clubs were organized by the Revolutionary Committee under the direct inspiration of the Bavarian Illuminati." The Jesuits created the Illuminati and were thus working through the Democratic clubs in America. Washington never realized he was taking on the Jesuits when he crushed the Whiskey Rebellion. John Adams became president after Washington left office. During John Adams' administration, war with Illuminati-controlled France was averted, but Washington made it known he would not resist a call from Congress to assume command of the army. Furthermore, Washington endorsed the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts that were designed to protect the United States from the extensive French Jacobin conspiracy. It is therefore no wonder that the vengeful eye of the Jesuits was focused on George Washington. After leaving office in 1797, Washington lived only 2 years and 9 months. From the onset of his illness in 1799 to his death was a mere 2 days. As with Monroe's death, the symptoms leading up to Washington's death were difficulty in breathing, tightness of the throat, and burning pain. Washington was only 67 years old when he died. Like Jefferson, Adams, and Monroe, there was no autopsy with Washington's death. However, the Jesuits made sure they had a servant on hand, Tobias Lear, to carefully plant the story that Washington had neglected to take off his wet clothes after coming in from his day of riding about his farms in snowy weather. Washington had taken cold, undoubtedly from being so much exposed the day before, and complained of a sore throat. Lear said this even though Washington explicitly told him that his great coat had kept him dry. According to Lear, we are to believe that George Washington, who survived the hardship of a winter at Valley Forge and other severe winters, did not know how to take care of himself in bad weather. The more likely truth is that Washington had opposed the plans and schemes of the Society of Jesus and was assassinated for his interference. Other American presidents, both in the 19th and 20th centuries, who would run afoul of the Jesuit order, would meet untimely deaths. For instance, the short presidency of William Henry Harrison. Harrison had been elected president on March 4, 1841. He would serve as president for only 35 days. At the end of March, the newly elected president came down suddenly with an illness and died. Many thought this was the result of his long inaugural address, which lasted over 2 hours in cold weather. But Harrison had been fine after the speech, and weeks had passed since the inauguration. Why was Harrison assassinated? One only has to go to his inauguration address to find the main reason. Harrison stated in the 4th paragraph of his speech, "We admit of no government by divine right," believing that so far as power is concerned, the beneficent Creator has made no distinction amongst men, that all are upon an equality, and that the only legitimate right to govern is an express grant of power from the governed. Like other leaders in the past, Harrison was thumbing his nose against the Holy Alliance, who practiced the divine right of kings to wield power as sanctioned by the Pope. Harrison was also unwilling to accept Texas, a slave territory, into the Union, which ran against the Jesuit plan of using the slave issue to agitate and divide the northern states from the southern states. Unlike Adams, Jefferson, and Monroe, the Jesuits did not wait for the 4th of July to eliminate the heretical President Harrison. Harrison was poisoned at the end of March and died on April 4th, 1841. Vice President John Tyler succeeded Harrison as president. The annexation of Texas was accomplished in 1845 under the watchful eye of the new president. Another president who died suddenly in office was Zachary Taylor. Taylor was elected president in 1848. Taylor was a Southern slaveholder who did not want to see slavery extended to any more areas of the country. Like Washington, Taylor was devoted to the Union of the American states, was very popular, and was a military man. Another crisis over slavery occurred by the Jesuits in 1850. A compromise was being pushed to avert a split in the Union. Taylor did not like the compromise being worked out in Congress. On July 4th, 1850, Taylor attended the groundbreaking ceremonies for the Washington Monument. He was fine upon returning back to the presidential mansion. Then he became ill after eating some raw fruit that some say was a bowl of cherries. A violent fever came upon him. Senator Benton commented that, "The violent attack commencing soon after his return to the presidential mansion." Old Rough and Ready frustrated his assassins and managed to fight the poison for 5 days and avoided the 4th of July curse. President Taylor died on July 9th. The Jesuits removed a strong, unifying leader and replaced him with a more malleable president in Millard Fillmore. Fillmore signed the compromise in 1850, just 2 months after Taylor's death. As the Jesuit agitation of the American states was reaching its climax in the 1850s, a trial occurred in 1855 at a courthouse in Illinois that would bring 2 faithful men together. These 2 men would join forces to fight the Jesuits. The first was a rebellious Roman Catholic priest by the name of Charles Chiniquy. The second was a lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Charles Chiniquy did not approve of the corrupt conduct of many of the priests he knew. These evil priests were drunkards, sexually promiscuous, and thieves, often stealing money and property collected from their parishioners.
The priesthood in Chicago was very corrupt, morally and every other way. They were drinking heavily. They would go on these retreats and take up a collection between themselves, put it all in a pot, and go out and buy a lot of booze. And they also rented a lot of hookers. Apparently there was a lot of sexual deviance going on at the time as well. And he didn't like that, though, and he tried to change it. He quoted exclusively from the Bible, and his bishop just could not tolerate that.
The heads of the Roman Church wanted Chiniquy to ignore these illicit and illegal activities. When he did not, Bishop Reagan of Chicago and another priest by the name of LaBelle arranged to have Chiniquy accused of rape. Chiniquy needed a good attorney. An attorney by the name of Abraham Lincoln was suggested.
Abraham Lincoln had a team of other lawyers under him, right? It's like a regular defense team. Lincoln being one lawyer, a gentleman by the name of Stephen R. Moore was another lawyer. And that was a big court case at the time. It was the most important court case that Lincoln ever had in his entire legal career, as a matter of fact. But it's been buried by the Illinois government.
The trial did not go well for Chiniquy. The general feeling was that he would be convicted.
Local newspapers of the time, they speculated that Chiniquy was going to be found guilty, and that was being broadcast throughout the entire Catholic community at that time.
Fortunately for Chiniquy, a witness came forward for the defense. Her name was Philomene Schwartz. Miss Schwartz had been in Father LaBelle's house the day the plot to frame Chiniquy had been concocted. Schwartz contacted Lincoln and agreed to testify.
She caught the midnight train to Urbana and met up with Abraham Lincoln and explained to him exactly what happened.
Once Bishop Reagan and Father LaBelle found out about the potential witness, they fled the city. The prosecution dropped the charges, and Chiniquy was vindicated. As they left the courtroom, Charles Chiniquy was in tears.
Lincoln says to him, "Why are you crying, Mr. Chiniquy?" He says, "Your enemies have fled and you're free to go." And he said, "I'm not crying for myself, Mr. Lincoln, I'm crying for you." He said, "Because I saw no less than 11 Jesuits with the sentence of death on their face today in this courtroom, and know for a surety they will kill you for what you have done." And Lincoln says, "Well, then let this be my death warrant," and he gives Chiniquy a bill for a mere $50. And then Lincoln sobers up and said, "It matters not where a man must die, but that he must die at the post of duty and honor."
Chiniquy's words of warning to Lincoln would prove to be true. The conspiratorial hand of the Jesuits at work, a conspiracy to further their goal of a world under papal control. Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States 5 years after Charles Chiniquy's trial. By 1860, agitation between the North and the South was so great that many of the Southern states decided to leave the Union over Lincoln's election. This agitation was designed from the beginning to drive a wedge between the North and the South and bring about a war that would result in the death of countless Protestants, clearing the way for the Jesuits to reconstruct America into a tool of conquest. Lincoln had no military background, and the perception in the South was that he was incapable of mounting a war to stop the Southern states from leaving the Union. However, the Jesuits had studied Lincoln and knew he would be a very effective leader. In his own way, Lincoln would serve the Jesuit ends. Those ends were, 1, to kill Protestants who lived mainly in the South, and 2, to undermine the Constitution, especially the doctrines of state sovereignty and states' rights. Once in office, Lincoln refused to accept the right of any state to leave the Union. He also refused to remove the federal troops from Fort Sumter under the command of Major Robert Anderson, who was a Freemason. As tensions mounted, the Jesuit-controlled Freemasons on both sides turned the standoff into a bloody war.
It's no coincidence that General Beauregard, a Roman Catholic Freemason, fired the first shots at Fort Sumter, and it's no coincidence that a Presbyterian Protestant Freemason incited those shots to be fired when he sent down the Star of the West to reinforce Fort Sumter, and that was Mason James Buchanan. James Buchanan started the war when he sent down the Star of the West, that ship, to reinforce the harbor, because the southern states had lawfully seceded if we had a union of consent. And I would like to add here that the 3 states that specifically reserved their right to secede in their state ratification papers were Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York. And if those 3 states reserved the right to secede, to withdraw the powers, the specific powers they had delegated to Washington, then every other state had the right. So, the southern states had the right to secede, the North had no right to stop it. So therefore, an attack against the southern states who had seceded was an act of war, and therefore it was indeed a war of northern aggression against the southerners who had rightfully seceded.
As the war progressed, it was obvious that not all was as it appeared to be on the surface. Time and again, generals on both sides made blunders and missed opportunities that would have ended the war sooner rather than later. The most glaring of these missed opportunities was the first battle of the conflict, the First Battle of Manassas on July 21, 1861. Lincoln had ordered the invasion of the South by Union troops. To stop them, Southern forces were moved into position in Virginia under Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston and Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard. Beauregard had ordered the firing of the first shot at Fort Sumter, and his family was not only Roman Catholic but also had Jesuit ties. During the course of the battle, the Confederate forces were beaten back until Colonel Thomas J. Jackson stood his ground against the invading Northern Army. Stonewall Jackson's heroic stand paved the way for the routing of the invading Union forces that soon withdrew towards Washington, D.C. Incredibly, the Southern commanders, Beauregard and Johnston, did not pursue the defeated Union troops, although prompted by many, including Stonewall Jackson. Johnston and Beauregard let the defeated Northern troops escape. If they had pursued the Northern Army, the South would have annihilated their enemy and ended the war in a few days. Along with Johnston and Beauregard, there were other Southern generals who seemed, at times, to be working against the South. Take, for instance, the legendary Robert E. Lee. It was General Robert E. Lee who ordered the disastrous Pickett's Charge at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863. Author and historian Bevan Alexander states, Pickett's Charge was doomed before it started. Sending massed bodies of men across nearly a mile of open ground against emplaced riflemen and banked cannons was simply an invitation for destruction. Bevan Alexander goes on to say that by insisting on fighting the North at Gettysburg and ordering Pickett's Charge, Lee had lost well over a third of his army and had destroyed the last offensive power of the Confederacy. It was also General Robert E. Lee who refused to listen to Stonewall Jackson concerning the South's overall strategy. Jackson realized that an offensive war against the North would result in the South's defeat. No matter how skilled a battle leader Lee was, he could never win the war by pitting the far weaker resources of the South against the tremendous economic and military power of the North. Stonewall Jackson's plan was to avoid the Northern strength, its field armies, and strike at Northern weakness, its undefended factories, farms, and railroads. Jackson wanted to bypass the Union armies and to win indirectly by assaulting the Northern people's will to pursue the war. Jackson called this unrelenting war. Lee never fully accepted Jackson's view. However, a Union general named William Tecumseh Sherman did. Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea, conducting unrelenting war, broke the back of the South in 1864 and spelled the end of the conflict.
Lee was the one responsible for the defeat of Antietam or Sharpsburg when he left the Order 191 there wrapped up in a cigar. It was found by Yankee generals. Lee was behind that. Lee was behind not allowing Jackson to win at least 4 decisive battles against the Union forces. And this is spoken of and written very well in Bevan Alexander's great work, Lost Victories.
It is also worthy to note this picture of Robert E. Lee at the age of 38 with his son. Lee is displaying a Mason sign called the Hidden Hand. Compare that picture with these pictures. All display the same Masonic gesture. That the Jesuits had infiltrated Freemasonry in the late 1700s and had taken control of the leadership of this secret society was unknown to Freemasons serving in both the Northern and Southern armies. Essentially, all Freemasons were serving the Jesuits and the Pope. Besides Lee's inactions and blunders on the battlefield, as well as those of other Confederate generals, a case can be made that the South's greatest general, Stonewall Jackson, was murdered during the 4-day Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee being an accomplice.
Jackson brings forth his plan to Lee how to flank Hooker's army. and then we can attack him from the rear. And Lee says, well, go ahead. Instead of saying, praise God, yes, if we can defeat Hooker, we can then march across the Potomac to Washington, because that's all it would have taken. We were this close to keeping our liberty. But because Lee is in cahoots with Hooker, and there are Jesuits who are observers on the battlefield, as there were at Gettysburg, an arrangement is made between Lee and A.P. Hill, because A.P. Hill hated Jackson's guts. Jackson had A.P. Hill arrested. This is General A.P. Hill. General Jackson had General A.P. Hill arrested for insubordination. And Hill hated him for it. And so this was Hill's chance to get back. So Hill happens to have a subordinate general underneath him, who then will be used to fire upon Jackson. So Jackson, as he arranges his soldiers as they've flanked Hooker, and he tells them, whatever you do, do not stop. You march right through the federal camp. Well, what happens is A.P. Hill's general stops the whole movement. And so everything is almost thrown in disarray, and finally this guy's convinced, let's just keep going on. So by this time they're losing valuable time. Still, it was a rout, but it wasn't a defeat like it could have been. And Jackson realizes that something's very wrong. He is now betrayed by A.P. Hill, and he's betrayed by this other subordinate. So in the evening, Jackson is reconnoitering, trying to see what should be done, and he's fired upon by his own troops. And I show in my book that it was a conspiracy because some of the people there, Jackson didn't know who they were. They were Confederate officers, and Jackson never seen them before. So Jackson is wounded, but it's not mortal. He's bleeding, but he's bleeding severely. But what happens is that Major McGuire, the doctor, is called to his assistance. Well, the doctor then takes him off the way from the battlefield and amputates the arm, and his left arm, and Jackson is beginning to recover, but Lee orders him to be taken away from the battlefield by this doctor. And Jackson said, our men need our doctor. Why deprive our hurting, dying men of this valuable doctor? I'm getting better. But oh no, Lee gives the order to go to Guinea Station, take Jackson with you. And so Jackson is being taken there, and he's beginning to recover, and he's talking to the doctor, when can I get back, and so on. Well, the doctor gets him to Guinea Station and takes him away from the main house and takes him out to this little shack where only the doctor and he are allowed to be. And it's there that this dirty Freemason, Hunter McGuire, poisons Jackson, I believe, on about a Wednesday or Thursday. And then Jackson's wife is able to come, and she sees him, but Jackson's not well. His arm it's the famous picture of him where he's had his arm amputated, but you really don't see it. The sleeve is still there. But he's been poisoned for the first time. And then Friday or Saturday, he's given the final poisoning, and he can't survive. And so the doctor poisons him, and his wife Julie is pleading for him. Doctor, isn't there any more you can do for him? And so he dies. And with the death of Jackson, the poisoning of Jackson, then this very same wicked Hunter McGuire poisons Jackson's right-hand man, who's also a preacher, Sandy Pendleton, Colonel Pendleton. He poisoned him too. So the Jesuits are busy using this doctor to get rid of the true Southern Confederate leadership, Lee being a party to all of this.
Like many others, Stonewall Jackson was getting in the way of Jesuit plans and had to be eliminated. At this point, we should take note of a man by the name of James Clark. Clark graduated from West Point in 1829. After graduation, Clark was assigned to Louisiana. After a year of service, James Clark resigned his commission and converted to Catholicism. In 1844, Clark would become the first West Point graduate to join the Jesuits. Clark went on to teach mathematics and science at Georgetown University, and he became the president of Holy Cross. It was said that Clark took a lively interest in the doings of his former classmates. And just who were his former classmates? None other than Robert E. Lee and Joseph E. Johnston. One can also include Jefferson Davis in this list, since Davis graduated a year ahead of Clark. It can only be guessed as to what communications these former West Point graduates had with each other. But that a Jesuit was in communication with Lee, Johnston, and Davis during the period of the war between the states is surprising and somewhat shocking. And what is even more shocking were the activities of Confederate President Jefferson Davis in 1863. Protestant Jefferson Davis began corresponding with the Roman Catholic Pope.
Pope Pius IX, who was completely in the hands of the Jesuit order at this time, because he was not in their hands when he first became Pope. He writes a letter to Jefferson Davis acknowledging him as the President of the United States.
After the Battle of Gettysburg, there was a lot of correspondence that took place between the Davis government and the Vatican, the Davis government appealing to the Pope for official help and recognition, which Pope Pius IX eventually did give him.
Davis was no stranger to Roman Catholicism. He had entered the Dominican-operated College of St. Thomas Aquinas near Springfield, Kentucky, for 2 years. He was the only Protestant student at the school. Interestingly enough, the young Davis sought to become a Catholic, but was encouraged to remain Protestant. One must ask, why would the Roman Catholic Church turn down a convert? Did the Roman Church have plans for Davis that would be better served with him remaining a Protestant? After the war, Davis was sent a portrait of the Pope. Such a gift, said a great niece, was never before conferred on any but crowned heads. General Lee also had his own picture of Pope Pius IX, noting that the Pope was the only sovereign in Europe who recognized our poor Confederacy. Such was the attitude of these leaders of the Confederacy. Men who were easily fooled, or who were willingly playing along with the Jesuits' plan. It was these men who led the Protestants of the South into a war that they had no intention of winning. Shades of Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars come to mind. It should be remembered that for all of its posturing and open statements of support for the South, the papacy was really not on the South side at all.
The open but false policy of Rome was that the Pope was on the side of the South. And Chiniquy falls for this delusion in his book, unfortunately. The secret but true policy of Rome was that Rome was completely on the side of the radical red Republicans in the North. Stevens, Sumner, Bingham, the list goes on and on. So, because of this, the Jesuits made a show that they were behind the South to create more animosity on the part of the Northern Protestants against the Southerners of the South, because the Pope's against us by siding with the South. When in fact, we wanted the utter annihilation of the Southern Protestants.
Now let us turn our attention to the Union Army. What was true with the Southern generals, Lincoln, to his dismay, discovered was also true with his Northern generals. They had allegiances to others besides the Union and Lincoln. General George McClellan failed to employ his vastly superior forces to defeat Confederate General Lee on numerous occasions, the most famous of which was at the Battle of Antietam. Historian James M. McPherson has pointed out that the 2 corps of troops McClellan kept in reserve were in fact larger than Lee's entire force. The reason for McClellan's reluctance to put his reserve into the fight was that, as in previous battles, he was convinced he was outnumbered. It should also be pointed out that McClellan was a Freemason. The question has to be asked, who was McClellan really listening to, Lincoln or the Jesuit superior general? Earlier, we noted General Lee's disastrous orders to General Pickett at the Battle of Gettysburg. At the same battle, Union General George Meade allowed General Lee to escape. Meade was a Roman Catholic.
And after Gettysburg, Lee is allowed to escape because a Jesuit then rides into the camp of Roman Catholic General Meade. And Roman Catholic Meade refuses to pursue Lee's army and captures only one gun, when the South could have been defeated right then and there would not have been the rape, pillage, and plunder from 1863 to 65. There would not have been the destruction of General Sherman from Atlantis to Savannah. There wouldn't have been the burning down of Protestant Columbia. The four Protestant states of the South that were to be destroyed and plundered were Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Virginia. Those are the states that were plundered. New Orleans was under Butler the Beast, but Roman Catholic Louisiana was not persecuted. But it was those four key Protestant southern states that were made war upon. That would not have happened had Lee not been allowed to escape. And Chiniquy writes of this in his book when the Jesuit rode into the camp and spoke to Meade. So it was a war against the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Baptist people of the South, perpetrated by not only the generals of the North, Grant and Sheridan and Sherman and all those despicable criminals with their federal banditti and their Roman Catholic Irishmen that they brought over here to steal everything they could steal off the southern plantations and to rape the black southern women that were slaves. It was a general rapine, so bad that many of the black men took their women into the swamps and to deliver them from this Yankee pillage. It was a complete and total grand theft and larceny of the southern people.
In spite of the treacherous behavior on both sides, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army to General Ulysses S. Grant at the village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 2 days later, on April 11th, Lincoln made a speech discussing post-war America. In the speech, Lincoln spoke in a conciliatory manner toward the southern states. Let us all join in doing the acts necessary to restoring the proper practical relations between these states and the Union, they never having been out of it. These words, taken with the amnesty for all Southerners that Lincoln had proclaimed in November of 1863, show us that the President was not looking for further reprisals or punishments against the South. However, Rome and the Holy Alliance wanted no amnesty for the South. And going back to the hated Constitution with states' rights and freedoms derived from the Bible. Lincoln had served his purpose. It was time for his removal.
Lincoln was a useful tool, thinking he was actually saving the Union because he wanted to restore the southern states on the same footing they had left the Union, which would have frustrated the purposes of the Jesuit order by making a consolidated empire out of all the states.
To ensure total chaos, the Jesuits decided Lincoln would not be the only target.
So they came up with this plan to assassinate not just Abraham Lincoln, but the entire government.
The South had lost the Civil War, so they were going to take out Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, the head of the Northern Army, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Secretary of the State, William Seward, all in one night.
On April 14, 1865, only 5 days after Lee's surrender, the conspirators struck. Abraham Lincoln was shot while watching a play at Ford's Theater. He died the next morning, April 15th, at 7:22 a.m. Secretary of State Seward was attacked at his home. The assassin, Lewis Payne, repeatedly stabbed Seward and escaped. Miraculously, Seward recovered from his wounds. Vice President Johnson's assassin, George Atzelrod, lost his nerve at the last minute and fled the scene. And General Grant avoided his assassin by leaving town earlier in the day to check on a sick friend. But who were these assassins? Most people know about John Wilkes Booth, the man who pulled the trigger and killed Lincoln. But few realize that most of the conspirators were Roman Catholic. Even Booth had converted to Catholicism.
It's clear that John Wilkes Booth, while he was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, at the time he was plotting Lincoln's assassination, he was also meeting in the home of a very devout Roman Catholic woman by the name of Mary Surratt, right in Washington, D.C. And it was in her home that the plot to kill Lincoln was hatched.
The Jesuits of Washington, D.C. put together the plot for the assassination. The Jesuit power behind that plot was Bernardin F. Wiggett.
Jesuits, under the stream of an induction, they were not directly to be involved. They only were the elements, the intellectual element that will prepare this. The case of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the president, was killed by the Jesuits of Rome, but there was no a Jesuit there involved directly. Nevertheless, was the Jesuit who prepared the plot against his life and prepare and train those who were to kill him.
They arranged it.
Yes.
To be sure, the assassins were also Southerners, but they were first and foremost Jesuit assassins and agents of the foreign dictator called the Pope. Among the conspirators was Mary Surratt's son, John Surratt. His tale leads to the very doors of the papal palace in Rome.
4 of them were eventually hung, and the rest were sent to prison for various lengths of time. Booth was killed in a barn, but the story around Surratt is absolutely amazing. Surratt, after the assassination, John Surratt escaped to Canada. Now, the Southern government had a kitchen cabinet based in Montreal. So that's the first place he went, was to Montreal. And who's in Montreal to meet this Surratt was 2 priests. And they squirreled him away for about 6 months. At the same time, the government is looking all over for this guy. It's like the biggest manhunt in U.S. history, and they can't find him. And here he is sitting in a little town outside of Montreal, being protected by priests.
The Jesuits were behind this assassination. They controlled Surratt. Surratt called time outside of Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth does the shooting. The guard, the Secret Service guard, who's supposing to be guarding the entranceway to the booth of Lincoln, he just happens to leave his post. And he's never punished for it. So the assassination takes place. Surratt escapes to Canada. He's taken to Liverpool. He's taken from there to Rome. He enlists in the Pope's Zouave army. And in 1867, he is discovered through another Roman Catholic who reveals the truth about it. And he is then brought back to the United States and put on trial. He has 2 trials, and because Roman Catholics have more allegiance to their priests and the canon law than they do our country, when a Roman Catholic's on a jury, they can hang a jury and let the murderer go free, and that's exactly what happened to John Surratt.
As a result of the Surratt affair and the papal policy of not allowing Protestant churches within the city of Rome, the United States of America ended diplomatic relations with the Vatican in 1867. But even with the end of diplomatic relations with the U.S., the Jesuits had achieved a great victory. First, hundreds of thousands of Protestants were dead. Second, much of the Protestant South lay in ruins. Third, forcing the South at gunpoint to stay in the Union had dealt a severe blow to the Constitution and the concept of freedom. And lastly, Lincoln was dead, and the Jesuits were avenged for his interference in the Chiniquy trial and his attempt to restore the Republic to its pre-war state. Adding insult to this situation, the Jesuit-controlled radical Republicans in Congress, men like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, were able to pass the 14th Amendment in 1868. The 14th Amendment created a new type of citizen, a citizen of the United States. Whereas before, a man was a citizen of the state in which he was born, citizenship was now at the national level. Ostensibly, this new citizenship was created to help the freed slaves, but in reality, it was a measure that would allow the federal government to strip away constitutional rights from the people and replace those rights with privileges granted by the government.
In Maxwell versus Dow of 1899, the Supreme Court said that none of the Bill of Rights are privileges and immunities of 14th Amendment U.S. citizenship. And the great dissent by John Marshall Harlan, the first Harlan, must be read by every viewer as he goes out of his chair to say that we don't enjoy real liberty, that our rights of American freemen have been overthrown, that our Anglo-Saxon liberties are gone. And then he reiterates in 1908 in Twining versus New Jersey, when Twining versus New Jersey comes out and says the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, none of those amendments are privileges and immunities of United States citizenship under the 14th Amendment. That's why in court you take your Fifth Amendment privilege. That's why you own a gun with a privilege. That's why you worship God now by a privilege granted from Washington. This ought to make us irate. All we have is Soviet citizenship, but all of us are. Whites and blacks were all slaves of the Jesuits from Washington, D.C., and none of us have any absolute rights to limit the powers of Washington. The only thing that limits Washington's powers are the decisions of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's controlled by the Jesuits of Georgetown. You got 5 Roman Catholics sitting on it now.
But why was it so important to the Jesuits to create a nation? In his book, A Constitutional View of the Law of the Late War Between the States, Alexander Stevens tells us why.
In Volume 2, Alexander Stevens tells us on page 650 the real reason of the 14th Amendment. Quote, consolidation and empire. That's the purpose of the amendment. Consolidation of the states and empire. That's why I call it the Pope's Holy Roman 14th Amendment, corporate fascist, socialist, communist empire created by this 14th Amendment. He goes on and says, they have not as yet openly denied the federative character of the government. However, in direct war upon its principles, their acts have been covertly aimed. This is an exceedingly important fact to be specifically noted and kept in mind. These monstrous reconstruction measures, with all their enormities and fatal tendencies towards ultimate complete centralism and empire, are still based upon the assumption that the states, as separate integral parts, constitute members of what is still, in words at least, acknowledged to be a federal union. All these bold usurpations of power are, upon their face, nothing but resorts to induce or to compel under duress the peoples of the several southern states to go through the forms of adopting the 14th Amendment as an additional article to the Constitution. So, he then concludes, no system of representative government can be long maintained by any people who have not the intelligence to understand it, the patriotism to approve it, and the virtue to maintain inviolate both its form and principles as established. So this is the reason for the 14th Amendment. Consolidation and empire. And this is what Andrew Johnson understood was the purpose, and so he campaigned against it. And he called Lee a hero if that was the real reason for this war, to keep this consolidation and empire from being formed. The 14th Amendment was proclaimed ratified on July 28, 1868. That was the end of the Washington's Republic as established in 1787. So our white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant and Baptist Calvinist Federal Republic of these United States lasted from 1787 to 1868. And a new nation was established in 1868, and that is called the American Empire in my book, and it has existed from 1868 to the present. And it is squarely in the hands of the papacy for 2 reasons. For destroying heretics, liberals, perfidious Jews, and infidel Muslims and Buddhists over the last 100 years since the Spanish-American War, or since really the Indian War of the Great Plains. The War of the Great Plains from 1860 to 1890 was the annihilation of the Native American Indians so that they could build an empire from sea to shining sea. A terrible crime. And it was all led by a Roman Catholic Army general named Philip Sheridan, who was advised by America's most powerful Western Jesuit at the time, Pierre de Smet. And it was this Philip Sheridan who said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
With the 14th Amendment, the Constitution of the Founding Fathers was tossed into the dustbin of history, and centralization of power in Washington, D.C. was well underway. Now the American empire could begin in earnest. The American states, both in the North and South, would be subservient to the federal government and would be essentially slaves to this new master. In rapid succession, the United States found itself in one war after another. The Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and a host of smaller police actions, such as in Somalia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Libya. Looking over the last 150 years, one can discern the influence of the Jesuits in the initiation of these wars and conflicts for the purpose of building a world empire under their control. Early in the 20th century, the Jesuits were determined to start a new European war.
Germany expelled the Jesuits in 1872. Russia had expelled the Jesuits in 1820. France had expelled the Jesuits in 1880. Britain had formally, although not in actuality, had formally expelled the Jesuits in 1829. Every country in Europe, Switzerland, 1848, every country in Europe had expelled the Jesuits except Belgium. And so the Jesuits said, well, now we're going to have to punish these people because they obviously didn't learn the lesson with Napoleon Bonaparte. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Britain and we're going to use America, and we're going to have a second 30 Years' War. The first one was from 1618 to 1648. The second one's going to be from 1914 to 1945. We're going to have World War I. We're going to have the Bolshevik Revolution. We're going to have the Spanish Civil War. We're going to have World War II. We're going to just have continual war for 30 years, and we're going to control all the factions. We're going to control the Allies, and we're going to control the Axis.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the spark that ignited the First World War. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His inclusive policy towards the Slavic peoples and lenient treatment of Orthodox Christian Serbia made him unacceptable to Rome. He therefore could not be allowed to rule. The assassination was set for July 26, 1914. Since the year 1054, the Catholic Church has been waging war against Orthodox Christians. The Orthodox Christians did not accept the supremacy of the Pope. A war involving the major powers of Europe would be a perfect opportunity to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Orthodox Serbs and Russians killed. Afterwards, Rome would be in a better position to dominate these countries. Who shot the Archduke? Gavrilo Princip, a member of the secret society called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was founded by Freemasons. During the trial, Princip testified that his colleague, Siganovich, told me he was a Freemason, and on another occasion told me that the heir apparent, Franz Ferdinand, had been condemned to death by a Freemasons' lodge. Even though a Masonic group carried out the murder, all of Serbia was blamed. It was never pointed out at that time that the assassins were linked to Freemasonry, and that its upper levels had been under the control of the Jesuits for nearly a century. After World War I, a movement was put in motion to have a world government that would help the nations of the world live in peace. A peace controlled by the Jesuits. When this world government, or League of Nations, failed to materialize, the Jesuits pushed forward plans to create a second world war. Even before the end of World War I, the Jesuits had set in motion a plan to bring the Russian Orthodox Christians back into the fold of the Pope's control. Under the direction of their superior general, Vladimir Ledovchkovsky, the Jesuits instigated the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This revolution brought communism to Russia. The Jesuits had been thrown out of Russia over 100 years earlier, but now the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, admitted the Jesuits back into Russia in 1922. Lenin proved fickle and showed signs of disloyalty to the Jesuits. For this, he was poisoned, and his replacement, Joseph Stalin, was ready to carry on with the Vatican's bidding. As a boy, Stalin had obtained a scholarship to attend Tiflis Theological Seminary. Openly, the school was Orthodox Christianity, but behind the scene, it was run by the Jesuits. In 1931, Stalin was interviewed by Emil Ludwig. Ludwig, do you not admit that the Jesuits have good points? Stalin, yes. They are systematic and persevering in working to achieve sordid ends. But their principal method is spying, prying, worming their way into people's souls and outraging their feelings. Once in power, Stalin killed millions of people, both Jews and Orthodox Christians. He killed anyone who would resist the new Soviet state he created based on Marxism. What many failed to understand was that Marxism was based on the Jesuit slave plantations, or reducciones, in South America, and Sir Thomas More's book, Utopia.
What the Jesuits did is they were the masters of communism. Communism originates with the Roman Catholic traitor whose name was Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More betrayed King Henry VIII, gave his full allegiance to the Pope, and for which reason Thomas More was executed as a traitor, holding forth the Pope's temporal power over his allegiance to his king. Sir Thomas More is the author of Utopia. Utopia is the foundation for communism. So communism is Romanism. In fact, the orders, the many communities of the Roman Catholic institution, the Jesuit order, the Redemptorist, that goes on, they run on communist principles of universal equality. Communis is the Latin term. So therefore, communism is a brainchild of the Jesuits, but it has been made to look Jewish through implementing it through Marx and his Communist Manifesto, financed also by another Masonic British Freemason, Engels.
Besides establishing communism in Russia after World War I, the Jesuits sought to re-establish the Pope's physical kingdom that had been taken from him in 1871. On June 7, 1929, the Lateran Treaty was ratified, which re-established the Pope's domain called Vatican City. The new Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini, was instrumental in bringing about the treaty. The treaty occurred only a few months before the economic crash that started in America and quickly spread around the world, called the Great Depression.
Approximately $90 million worth of gold in lira, I think it was about $1 billion worth of lira, something like that, was given to the papacy by the Italian government. So that, for reparations, for lack of a better word, because we had been suppressed from 1870 to 1929, you owe us all this money. So, Benito Mussolini enslaves the Italian Catholic people, makes them pay this huge sum, which they didn't want to pay. And what does the papacy do with this money? Well, this treaty is in about February or March. In October, the Jesuits crashed the American stock market. And they used their number one short seller, the Irish Roman Catholic Joseph P. Kennedy, to do it. So they sell short, the margin calls can't be met, the stock market crashes, and what happens? The Vatican takes their millions of dollars that they got from Mussolini and they invest it in all the corporations and businesses that are busted on Wall Street, and they buy it all for pennies. So by the time Wall Street comes back into power, the Archbishop of New York completely controls all the major corporations in this country.
As banks began to fail, the Federal Reserve did not act to pump money into the system, which it should have done had those in control of it wanted to keep the banks afloat. As the chaos lingered and many lost their jobs and were driven into poverty, the Jesuits created a dictatorship out of the office of the President of the United States. In March 1933, the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed into law a state of national emergency. Under such a state of emergency, the Constitution was set aside, ostensibly for the public good, until the emergency was canceled by the president. Roosevelt never canceled the emergency. This was verified in 1973 by the Church Matthias Committee and published in Senate Report 93-549. No American president since then has canceled the emergency. And even though Congress passed the National Emergency Termination Act in 1974, this termination was in name only. The reality was that the emergency powers taken were never returned. They continued in the U.S. Code as permanent powers. Thus, we are currently in a state of emergency or dictatorship. It should also be noted that Roosevelt was a 32nd degree Freemason. FDR was obliged to follow the orders of the head of this secret society. His oath to Freemasonry superseded his oath to the U.S. Constitution. And as we have seen, the man in control of Freemasonry was the Jesuit Superior General. In Germany, the Vatican had in place Adolf Hitler. It is usually not emphasized, but Hitler was a Roman Catholic. Hitler praised the Roman Catholic Church, saying that, "Until now, there has never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church." Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's head of the SS, was also a Roman Catholic. Friedrich Hofhet wrote, "Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and most members of the party's old guard were Catholics." After the war, Walter Schellenberg, former head of German counterespionage, stated, "The SS organization had been constituted by Himmler according to the principles of the Jesuit order." Himmler's title as Supreme Commander of the SS was to be the equivalent of the Jesuits' general. Incredibly, although he killed and tortured millions, the Vatican never excommunicated Hitler. In fact, not one of the mass murderers of the Third Reich was ever excommunicated by the Vatican. The day Hitler died, the Spanish dictator Franco, also a Roman Catholic, had this statement run in the publication Reforma. "Adolf Hitler, son of the Catholic Church, died while defending Christianity." As a loyal son, Hitler killed heretics, including Protestants, Jews, Orthodox Christians, and even liberal Catholics. All told, the war dead numbered between 62 to 78 million people. 11 million of the total dead from World War II died in concentration camps, 6 million being Jews. The Jewish Holocaust was never condemned by Pope Pius XII, or for that matter, by any other pope. Why this silence? The Jews, like all heretics, resisted conversion to Roman Catholicism and obedience to the Pope. Who financed Hitler? The answer is clear and easily verified. The Vatican and many of the wealthy elite in the West gave Hitler the money he needed to build the Third Reich. As early as 1919, Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli met a young Adolf Hitler in Munich. The meeting occurred at night while all the household was asleep, except for the nun who attended Archbishop Pacelli. Her name was Pascalina. According to Pascalina, Hitler told Pacelli that he was out to check the spread of aesthetic communism in Munich and elsewhere. It did not come as a surprise to her, therefore, in light of Pacelli's hatred of the Reds, to see the prelate present Hitler with a large cache of church money to aid the rising revolutionary and his small struggling band of anti-communists. "Go, quell the devil's work. Help spread the love of Almighty God," Pacelli told Hitler. "For the love of Almighty God," she heard the young man Adolf Hitler reply. Money for this young revolutionary also came from industrialists in the West.
Hitler's rise to power was financed by London and New York and Berlin. They were the Knights of Malta running the banking institutions of the world.